We all know the name Jeffrey Dahmer, but as a therapist, I look at him and see something different, a series of missed clinical opportunities. Could Jeffrey Dahmer have been prevented from becoming one of America's horrific serial killers? Wow, that's something to think about. Why did he do what he did? Today isn't about gore. It's about the timeline of his mind. I'm opening this clinical file to see if we can identify exactly where the intervention should have happened, but it didn't. I'm a licensed professional counselor with over 20 years of clinical experience, and I bring my clinical expertise to these true crime cases. It gives me an opportunity to take a break from all the therapy that I do every day. It's just kind of one of my hobbies. To give you a summary of Jeffrey Dahmer, I know you've heard of him, but do you know exactly what he did? He was often called the Milwaukee Monster, and he was one of America's most notorious serial killers between 1978 and 1991. If you were around at that time, you know exactly where you were. It's one of those events that really stand out. He murdered 17 young men and boys, primarily in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area. Dahmer typically lured his victims, often from vulnerable backgrounds, to his apartment by offering money or friendship. It's pretty sad to lure someone on the guise of friendship, but that's what he did. And once there, he drugged them before carrying out the fatal attacks. His crimes involved extreme violence and disturbing acts that shocked the nation when they were discovered. After his arrest in 1991, following a victim's escape, which is pretty amazing, that led police to his apartment, Dahmer then confessed in detail. That's what a lot of these guys do. They enjoy the details and telling everybody about it. Evidence found at the scene revealed the horrifying extent of his actions. He was convicted of 16 murders in Wisconsin and one in Ohio, and he received multiple life sentences. Dahmer was later killed in prison in 1994 by another inmate. It was almost like a subdued and anticlimactic end for such a notorious serial killer. His case raises questions, serious questions about law enforcement oversight, mental health, and how such crimes went undetected for so long. Now, I know back then, in those early days, mental health wasn't really considered a viable option. In some cases, it still is today. Some people still have that stigma that mental health doesn't work, doesn't help. We don't need it. I'm not crazy. But that's not really what mental health is. And back then, the law enforcement weren't really trained like they are now in mental health. So it's not about pointing fingers, but it's about looking at the timeline and finding out all of these early opportunities for intervention that were missed. I want to talk about how he was described as normal, happy child until a specific surgery and family move. Dahmer was typically a very happy little boy. People talked about it. Jeffrey was remembered by family and neighbors as energetic and happy and even normal little boy in the first few years of his life. How in the world did he become a monster? He was outgoing enough that no one saw the serious trouble that was coming. At around age 4, he underwent double hernia surgery. After recovery, the shift was noticeable. He became markedly quieter, more withdrawn, and less socially engaged. Think about a 4-year-old little boy goes into the hospital, probably very clinical, very strange, and afraid to go under surgery, and that's what happened. Then, on top of that, layer in the family moves. His family had frequent relocations from Milwaukee to Ohio to Bath Township. It forced him to constantly restart socially right when he was already pulling inward. It was a perfect storm. Had the surgery, and then his family moved around a lot. Each new school neighborhood reinforced the sense that connections were temporary. I want to stop here for a minute. Not everyone who goes through surgery, not everyone who moves around a lot is going to turn into a serial killer. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying, I'm wanting to show the puzzles, the pieces of the puzzle here that are starting to come together, and how his behavior started very early and many people just brushed it off. This good child mask that he hid, the emerging detachment, he was really good at that. Adults saw a quiet and polite kid who didn't cause problems, which made the later red flags easier to dismiss as just a phase. He's just going through a phase. But that phase turned into specific personality traits, like schizoid traits. It's a preference for solitary activities and a lack of strong emotional ties. It involves a persistent preference for being alone, solitary activities, and a limited desire or even capacity for emotional close relationships. It may not be full schizoid personality disorder yet, but clear early patterns were starting to form. What it looked like in Dahmer was that he spent more and more of his time alone, and he showed little interest in forming friendships. You can understand why if he kept moving around. He would just say, yep, there's someone I probably could have been friends with, but I choose not to because we're going to leave again. So why even try? And he appeared emotionally flat or even detached, even with family. Though here's a key. It's not just with other people that he felt detached and flat. He felt that with his family. That's pretty key here. He observed life more than he participated in it, which is also key for Dahmer. These traits often develop as a protective response to inconsistent caregiving and repeated disruption. The child learns people leave or disappoint, so it's safer not to even need them. I'm only going to rely on myself. The long-term implication here is that emotional coolness becomes a foundation for later severe attachment insecurity. The desperate fear of abandonment that fueled his crimes paired with his inability to bond in healthy ways. Those are recipes for disaster. They were happening. They were brewing, and people were dismissing the behavior. How many quiet, well-behaved kids are we missing because they don't act out? They just quietly disappear inside of themselves. I think there's probably a lot going on. I worked in the school system for a long time, and I worked specifically with kids with trauma and abuse in their life. And there were those typical ones that reacted out of their trauma. They were usually deemed the problem child, but there were ones that were quiet as well. And nobody had any issues with them, but they had just as much trauma and abuse in their life. Maybe that was happening here with Jeffrey. Later on in his early obsession with animals started to form. But why is biological curiosity a common mask for a much darker psychological detachment? Well, if you look at the patterns of a lot of serial killers, you'll notice that many have harmed animals as a young child. By middle school and early teens, Dahmer began collecting roadkill. Yep, going around the road looking for roadkill. Then he would dissect them and then preserve bones in organs, often in his backyard or garage. He told people it was a scientific curiosity or an interest in biology. And because his father was a chemist, it seemed like that's a natural extension. He must get it from his dad. So why was this a major missed red flag? Well, normal childhood curiosity about animals is common. I had it. I used to trap and I used to skin animals, but not like this. I didn't dissect them. I didn't preserve them. But the intensity and the secrecy and focus on death and decay crossed into something darker. It's a sign of emotional detachment and a fascination with lifelessness. Do you see the pieces coming together here? He's starting to develop into a monster. This behavior can represent an early blurring of the fantasy-reality boundary in a way to exert total control over something that won't leave under his demand. Animals couldn't abandon him the way people did. This is sometimes discussed as a precursor to necrophilic interest or objectification, treating living beings as objects to possess and control. It's one of the more reliable early warning signs and developmental pathways of certain violent offenders. Think Ted Bundy and other serial killers. The irony here is that his father actually encouraged some of the science experiments, seeing it as intellectual curiosity rather than a cry for help. It's a heartbreaking example of how well-meaning parents can miss the psychological meaning behind a child's behavior. Again, he's going through a phase, or at least he's interested in something. Not blaming his dad, not at all, not here, not for not knowing what to do. He was well-meaning, but the signs were there. Those childhood sessions with dead animals became the template for what he later did with human victims. Dismemberment, preservation, keeping parts as trophies. The pattern started small, but then it escalated when the need for control meant his deepening isolation and alcohol abuse. Lionel and Joyce, Dahmer's parents, was a high conflict from early on. With loud arguments, police were called by neighbors multiple times, mutual accusations of gross neglect and duty of extreme cruelty in a divorce filing. Lionel worked long hours as a chemist and was often absent, and Joyce struggled with severe anxiety, depression, hypochondria, and heavy prescription medication use, creating an emotionally chaotic home. Jeffrey, he witnessed this volatility every day, which added layers of unpredictability and fear to his already detached personality. His parents' divorce finalized in July of 1978, right around Jeffrey's high school graduation. It's a bitter custody battle focused almost entirely on his younger brother, David. Jeffrey was left out. In homes like this, kids don't just experience bad parenting. They absorb the message that relationships are unsafe, explosive, and unreliable. When a child feels abandoned or unseen during their formative years, how does that manifest in their adult relationships? This touches on attachment theory. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth explains how early bonds with caregivers shape our sense of safety and worth. Secure attachment comes from consistent, responsive care, but insecure attachment develops when that care is missing, frightening, or unpredictable. In Dahmer's case, years of emotional neglect and parental conflict likely created a disorganized or fearful avoidant attachment style, craving closeness but terrified of it at the same time. Intense fear of abandonment paired with an inability to form healthy emotional bonds, people become objects to control rather than individuals to connect with. When a child repeatedly feels unseen or abandoned emotionally, the brain adapts by shutting down vulnerability. Later, this can fuel desperate maladaptive attempts to prevent people from leaving. Exactly what we see in Dahmer's crimes. What happens when the very people who are supposed to teach you that you're safe are the very ones who make you feel most alone? When he turned 18, he was at their house by himself for a long time. After their divorce, Joyce's mother moved out with younger brother David to live with relatives in Wisconsin. His father had already moved out. Jeffrey, he just graduated, was left behind in an empty family house in Ohio with no money, no food, a broken refrigerator, and weeks of total isolation. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Profound abandonment trauma on top of years of emotional neglect. No one checked in on him, no support, just silence and his own spiraling thoughts. This is a textbook example of how accumulative attachment wounds can reach a breaking point. The house became both a prison and a stage where his internal fantasies could finally play out without interruption. Only weeks after being abandoned in an empty house, Dahmer picked up Stephen Hicks, brought him home, and killed him when Hicks tried to leave. The first horrific enactment of "You're not allowed to abandon me." Both parents were so consumed by their own conflict and their fight over David that Jeffrey, legally an adult, was essentially forgotten in the chaos. A heartbreaking demonstration of how parental focus on the younger child can leave the older one completely invisible. There's long-term ripple effects that can happen here. The moment of total aloneness cemented the pattern. People will always leave unless you make it impossible for them to do so. By his early teens, Dahmer's inner life had become more vivid and comforting than anything happening around him. The real world felt chaotic, rejecting, and lonely. His fantasies offered total control, predictability, and escape. When Dahmer was around 13 to 14, he began having intense reoccurring sexual fantasies centered on dominance, corpses, and complete possession of another person, long before his first murder. These thoughts started taking up more and more of his mental space. He described retreating into his private world where he could have absolute power over someone who could never leave or reject him. Reality kept disappointing him, but fantasy never did. This growing preference for an internal fantasy life over real relationships is a classic sign that the boundary between thought and action is starting to weaken. Imagine living in a world where your own mind feels like the only place you're not alone, and that place is getting darker every year. How does a person move from a thought to a compulsion? Paraphilic disorders involve intense recurrent sexual interest in atypical objects, situations, or non-consenting people that cause distress or harm. And in Dahmer's case, this centered on necrophilia and the desire for a completely compliant partner. It usually starts with thoughts, then repeated mental rehearsal strengthens the arousal, and then fantasy alone eventually stops being enough, and the person feels increasing pressure to act it out in reality for the same level of relief. This is the slippery slope. Each step reinforces the next. The brain's reward system gets hijacked, making healthy sexual or emotional experiences feel flat by comparison. Without intervention, the compulsion builds until fantasy feels incomplete. Dahmer himself said the fantasies were there for years, but he lacked the opportunity until the right or wrong circumstances aligned. And that gap between fantasy and action is where prevention could have made a huge difference. His struggles with alcoholism in the military and early jobs also plays a role here. From a clinical perspective, he was self-medicating to numb the intrusive thoughts he didn't understand. Heavy drinking began around age 13 to 14. Very young. Scotch in school, hidden bottles, and it worsened dramatically when he was in the Army from 1979 to 1981, where he was stationed in Germany as a medic. How ironic is that? He was a medic. He was discharged early for alcohol abuse after multiple incidents. Later jobs followed the same pattern of showing up impaired. He couldn't hold down a job. From a therapist's view, this was classic self-medication. Alcohol numbed the intrusive, unwanted fantasies, reduced anxiety about his sexuality and loneliness, and lowered inhibitions when he did the act. He often drank heavily right before or during the crimes to get through them. Alcohol provided short-term relief, but it eroded his already fragile impulse control and judgment. It created blackouts and made the fantasies feel more urgent and normalized over time. The Army actually sent him to alcohol abuse program, but it didn't address the underlying paraphilic compulsions or attachment wounds. Treating the symptoms, which is drinking, without the root cause left the deeper issues untouched. Every murder Dahmer committed happened while he was intoxicated. The alcohol was both his coping mechanism and the fuel that moved him from fantasy into reality. How often do we see someone just drinking too much when what's really happening is an attempt to quiet something much louder inside? Here is the greatest missed opportunity, perhaps in history. In 1991, there was a police interaction between Dahmer and a 14-year-old boy. The 14-year-old victim escaped Dahmer and was returned back to him by the police. It was May 27, 1991, just 2 months before Dahmer's final arrest. 14-year-old Konyak, brother of a boy Dahmer had previously molested in 1988, escaped from Dahmer's apartment. He was naked, bleeding, drugged, and incoherent, wandering the street near 25th and State Street in Milwaukee. 2 women who were neighbors saw him, called the police, and tried to protect him. Officers John Belserek and Joseph Gabrish responded. Dahmer calmly returned to the scene and convinced the officers that Konyak was his 19-year-old adult lover who had simply drunk too much. Despite the boy's obvious distress and the neighbors' protest, the officers escorted Konyak back inside Dahmer's apartment, where the body of another recent victim, Tony Hughes, was already lying on the floor. They left the boy there alone, and Dahmer killed him shortly after the police departed. How do certain individuals learn to mimic normalcy so well that they can bypass authority figures and even professionals? There is a concept called the mask of sanity from Hervey Clerkey's work. It describes how some individuals with severe personality disturbances can appear completely calm, rational, believable on the surface, even while hiding extreme pathology underneath. Dahmer was polite, soft-spoken, and matter-of-fact with the officers. No obvious rage, no panic. He didn't look like a serial killer. He offered a simple, socially plausible explanation that fit their assumptions about adult-gay relationship and intoxication. This works so well because people with strong masks learn to read social cues, maintain eye contact, and deliver stories with just enough emotional flatness to seem credible rather than erratic. It bypasses normal alarm bells that would go off with someone visibly agitated. The mask is especially dangerous when combined with Dahmer's schizoid and avoidant traits. He didn't come across as threatening because he genuinely didn't show typical emotional signals. That's what made him so dangerous. How many times have we trusted someone simply because they sounded reasonable and looked normal? This was the ultimate missed intervention, where a clinical evaluation could have saved multiple lives. This single encounter was the greatest missed opportunity in the entire case. A proper check of Dahmer's name would have shown he was already on probation for child molestation. A welfare check or mental health evaluation could have uncovered the horror inside the apartment. At this point, Dahmer was in full escalation. The fantasies had moved completely into reality, and his ability to maintain the mask was keeping authorities at bay. An intervention here, even a brief clinical hold or deeper investigation, likely would have saved Konyak and the 5 additional victims who died after this night. The officers accepted surface presentation over visible evidence of distress. Systemic issues like bias or poor training on domestic and sexual situations, a failure to run records combined with Dahmer's polished mask created a perfect storm. The officers even joked on the radio afterward about domestic squabbles and lovers' quarrels in the gay community. A heartbreaking example of how the mask plus assumptions cost lives. The incident led to the firing of the 2 officers. They were later reinstated with back pay, but it also created a civil lawsuit by the families. It remains one of the most analyzed law enforcement failures in modern true crime. This moment shows how dangerous a combination of untreated paraphilic compulsions, attachment wounds, and convincing masks can be. It doesn't just fool friends and family. It can fool the very systems meant to protect the vulnerable. The why here matters. Understanding Dahmer isn't about sympathy. It's about prevention. It's not about giving him an excuse. It's about showing how he became a monster. Jeffrey Dahmer's psychological profile is never about offering sympathy or excuses for what he did. It's about prevention and spotting patterns before they turn tragic. The crimes were horrific and inexcusable, but the why behind them, severe attachment wounds, emotional detachment, unchecked paraphilic fantasies, and self-medication through alcohol, show us certain risk factors can combine in one person. When we look at the early isolation and the missed flags and the slow escalation, we can see how him becoming a monster was forming. We're learning how to interrupt the process in others who may be heading down the similar paths. Knowledge like this helps families and schools and mental health professionals recognize when quiet withdrawal or odd interest are more than just a phase. We can hold both truths. Dahmer was fully responsible for his actions, and society can still do better at catching warning signs. What can we as society and as mental health professionals learn from this regarding the importance of early intervention for isolated youth? As a licensed professional counselor, what stands out the most is how many opportunities for early intervention were missed, from childhood emotional blunting and animal cruelty through the painful family divorce and total abandonment at 18, all the way to the 1991 police encounter. We need to pay closer attention to isolated youth who seem fine on the surface. The quiet ones who withdraw rather than act out are often the ones who fall through the cracks. Mental health systems must treat the whole picture: attachment issues, emerging paraphilic interest, substance use, and social isolation, instead of just addressing the symptoms in isolation. Early consistent support during key transitional periods like adolescence and young adulthood can literally save lives. Cases like Dahmer's remind us that prevention is possible when we stop dismissing red flags as just a weird kid or a family problem and start connecting the dots with compassion and clinical curiosity. What part of this psychological profile surprised you the most? The early schizoid traits, the power of the mask of sanity, the role of attachment wounds, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and these conversations are where real learning happens. If this clinical breakdown gave you new ways to think about how trauma and isolation shape behavior, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Your comments and shares help more people understand that mental health red flags deserve attention long before they become headlines. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time. Good day and good night.